Hello and welcome back to Hydroponics Daily with me, Dr. Russell Sharp. Today's episode is about seed storage, which most hydroponic growers will be interested in. It's important to note that not all seeds can be stored. A large proportion of seeds are what scientists term recalcitrant, and this means once they dry out or they're stored in the cold, then they die. And as most seed storage techniques involved keeping seeds dry and cold, then would be essential. So make sure that the seed you're trying to store is not recalcitrant first. Most crop species, though, are not recalcitrant. Many tropical tree fruit crops are recalcitrant. So mango, mangosteen, coconut, all large-seeded tropical fruits, they're all recalcitrant. And then closer to home, the oaks are all recalcitrant, horse chestnuts, sweet chestnuts, black walnut, hazel, and many, many of the maple species. So sycamores, Japanese maples, things like that. And then some small seeded species like ivy, Heterohelix, fantastic scientific name, that is also recalcitrant. So it cannot be stored. So once you've ruled out recalcitrant seeds, you might also find that the plant you're growing grows into a third category, and that is intermediate, where they don't store very well long term. So they can be dry stored for a short period of time, and that includes coffee, Coffea arabica, lettuce, which is a fairly common crop, and parsnips. So if you've had parsnips and lettuce seeds in your seed box for a long time, then probably worth buying some new ones. Parsnips are notoriously poor at germinating, and that's why on the packet it should recommend to plant at least 2 or 3 seeds at every point you want a parsnip plant. You can always thin them out later if they were stored better than you thought they would, but that's the recommendation. And you'll also find lettuce and parsnip seeds always come foil packed to really maintain their viability, whereas not the majority of seeds come foil packed. Like spring onions, that wouldn't come foil packed normally. That would just come in a paper envelope. And then if your seeds do prove to be good for long-term storage, then you might have to consider that long-term storage might not be good for your seeds. And that's because seeds in storage suffer from mutations. They can't recover from mutations like a living organism that's growing can. And so mutations build up over the years. And this is why when you bring out seeds from long-term storage, they can often have deformed growth. Now, when it came to melons and cucumbers and I think pumpkins, they used to say that long-term storage was better because you produced a better crop. But it's found from subsequent studies with commercial cultivation that this is not true, and that the ionizing radiation from the universe and from human activity causes long-term damage to the seeds. So if you're growing a crop that's prone to mutations, then yes, it might be able to store it for 10, 20, 30 years, but you've got to ask yourself, is that the best seed to buy? Should you actually be buying in fresh seed every year? People do experiment with ionizing radiation, though, for producing interesting mutations. And in fact, seeds are often taken up to the International Space Station and the Chinese Space Station. Did you know the Chinese have got a space station? They have. And they take seeds up there and then they bring them down and then work out whether they're good for certain crops and things like that, and give them to schools to do experiments with. Often that's a lot of the seeds that go up there are just for schools to play around with, and compared to seeds that have stayed their entire time on the surface of the earth. When it comes to the ideal conditions to keep seeds in when they're in storage, you want to dry them out as much as possible and store them at refrigerator temperatures. You also want to keep them in the dark because many seeds are what are termed photoblastic, and that means that germination is improved or is promoted by light. Lettuce is a good example of that. It was first discovered, phytochrome, the pigment that involves photoperiod, was actually discovered in seedlings, and it's also involved in germination. So you want to keep them dark, you want to keep them cold, and But the problem with keeping the things cold in, say, a refrigerator is they can also get damp. So you want to make sure they're well sealed or they're with silica gel. And then you also want to make sure they're clean, because any microorganisms that grow on them are going to reduce their viability. They're going to feed off the seed coat, and certainly any insects. So the big killer of seeds is weevils. Weevils are beetles that have evolved to feed just on seeds. So you want to really make sure there's no access for weevils to get in there, and any fungi can't grow on them. If you're able to get your seeds down to maybe the moisture content down to 5 to 7 degrees Celsius, 5 to 7%, you can actually freeze your seeds, but you do need to make sure they're very dry. That is the technique that's used by the seed banks around the world. So in the UK, we've got Wakehurst Placed, which is the national seed bank for what you might have heard of Kew Gardens. They're probably the biggest botanical gardens in the world. And they store a vast quantity of the world's species of seeds, mainly native species. And obviously it's funded by the UK taxpayer and, UK private sector, but don't expect to have access to that if you work in the private sector. F us, right? Private sector, how dare we actually make use of the resources that our country has actually developed over the centuries. No, you're not allowed to access any of those seeds to commercialise them. They have to be just kept for the scientists at Kew Gardens to look after for some future, even though on their remit and the way they talk about it, they say they help, improve the UK GDP and help industry. It's an absolute nonsense in my eyes. It really annoys me that the seed banks like Wakehurst Place, and you're not allowed to get seeds from them if you're from the private sector. In America, there's also seed banks. They are under threat because of federal government funding cuts, I believe. So those freezers could be turned off and the seeds ruined. There's also the Svalbard seed bank that stores all the crop species and varieties. That's up on Svalbard, which is an island north of Norway, very far north of Norway, up in the Arctic Circle. It's actually threatened, though, by climate change, ironically, in that the ice is retreating from around the seed bank, and they've had to actually keep the freezers on for longer, whereas normally they were going to rely on the background cold temperatures. So there's seed banks. That's my high horse about seed banks, what I think of seed banks. So you obviously do not need a seed bank. You can use a freezer, or you can just use a fridge if you can't get your seeds dry enough. You also want to make sure you're just storing the seed and you're not storing any husk or what we call chaff, because that's going to decompose as well in storage. So just make sure you know what the seed is and what the outer coat is. That might sound simple, but you think of a peanut and, you might think the whole thing, the whole casing is part of the seed and stuff like that. So I'm not sure if it is. I don't know. Peanut, what part of the peanut do you eat? I don't know. That's a really bad example, Russell. What can I think of that's a good example? I was going to say acorn, but that's not a good example because that's a recalcitrant seed. Coriander. Coriander is a good example. That's got a husk and inside that the seeds. But with coriander, often sometimes you get it and it's still in the husk. So probably not the best example either there. But I'll move on. It's important when you dip into a packet of seeds that you seal it up straight away and you put it back in a sealed container, because often seed packets come sealed and then you might just want to roll it up. Make sure you put some sellotape over it, or ideally put it in a plastic bag. And also that when you get the seeds out, your hands are not wet and covered in wet grown media and things like that. It's tempting, and I know it's tempting to, when you get the seeds out, you get a few more out. You don't want to waste any seeds. But if you're putting seeds back in to the seed packet that have been exposed to your wet hand, that's really the worst case scenario. How long can a seed last for in storage? Well, that depends on who you believe. There are reports of sacred lotus seeds that have laid buried in silt deposits in dry lakes in China and Japan, successfully germinating 1,000 years after they were dug up. There are reports of Arctic lupin, which sounds like a lovely plant, from the permafrost dating back from 10 to 15,000 years, still being viable. However, the world record for seed resurrection is currently held by the narrow-leaved campion. Sounds like it's another delightful plant, that, and one for your borders, herbaceous borders. And that was buried in Siberian permafrost. And that was brought back to life. And that was thought to be 32,000 years. So I doubt your refrigerator would last 32,000 years, or your freezer. But this, in the Siberian permafrost, this amazing plant was, still going strong with the mammoths and the saber-toothed tigers. Its mother of those seeds, probably other, the other amazing animals that no longer exist, and amazing plants. So many of the plants grown in hydroponics will last at least 10 years in storage. So tomatoes and other things like that, you don't need to worry about. As long as they're stored well, chilies, they'll all survive many, many years in storage. And so just make sure you keep them as dry as possible and don't expose them to light. Keep them away from microbes and keep them nice and cool or frozen if you've got the facilities to do so. I'm not sure if there's any work that's been done on techniques to improve seed storage that you could do, like chemical treatments or treatments to the mother plant. Certainly, harvesting from very, very ripe fruits will produce a seed that is extremely dormant. And I think this is one of the reasons why really hot, extreme chilies often struggle to germinate when you get them, in that they're taken from really ripe, extreme fruits. Whereas if you were taken, seeds will often be viable when they're taken from green fruit and will have much lower dormancy levels. Now, whether they have lower ability to storage, I don't think that's ever been done. It would be a very, very long experiment, sort of lifetime experiment to do. So I don't think anyone's rushing out to get that experiment. I don't think anyone's going to be, and when the results come in, I don't think anyone's going to, whoa, the results are in. This was an amazing experiment and we found out so much from it. So yeah, you're not going to get much kudos from doing that experiment, even though it would be interesting to know. So yeah, you can often harvest seeds from very, very unripe fruits. That's something to consider. Be interesting to look at that with the big black mama chili seeds I've got growing this year. I'll harvest some seeds from various stages of ripeness and store them over the winter period this year, and then next year I will germinate them and I will report back whether the unripe extreme chilies had a lower, did they germinate faster, basically, and could we reduce the time it takes to grow extreme chilies by doing that? Because one of the big constraints in growing extreme chilies is just the time it takes for them to germinate and the high temperatures required. If we could produce extreme chilies that germinated at much lower temperatures, much faster, then the seeds would be, you could get a harvest in certain situations where you couldn't, like a cold greenhouse in the UK or in, say, Ohio in America. And the people who grow the chilies would get a lot less returns or refunds, because often people will be complaining, going, I bought these chilies and they didn't germinate. None of them germinated. And then the companies will give them the refund. And then 10 days later, this person who complained and was on Twitter moaning, all their seeds will germinate. So I think that's actually a really valuable trial. So I'll definitely do that this year and report back. That's been Hydroponics Daily for today. Seed storage and everything that goes into it. And we'll probably do another seed episode tomorrow, because I think there's a lot to cover that we haven't already covered on Hydroponics Daily. Please share this podcast if you found it useful in any way. Really trying to grow the listener base, and it's really encouraging to know as it goes up the charts that people are listening. And obviously the more that happens, the more effort I can put into every episode at the end of every working day. But thank you very much for listening so far, and see you again tomorrow. Thank you.